Across the early modern period, European wars often occur regionally between various competing alliances, but one of the earliest examples to the contrary was the Seven Years' War, a global conflict which determined the fate of Europe, the Americas, and India. Some of these conflicts created events we still remember today and laid the groundwork for future conflicts. But did it have to be like this? What if the superpower of the 18th century wasn't Great Britain? Today we will ask, what if France won the Seven Years' War? The nations of Europe had several different disputes and tense relations in the lead up to the Seven Years' War. These were dominated by two competing rivalries, France versus Britain and Austria versus Prussia. The French and British both held competing claims against each other and their North American colonies. The French had built their colonies off a small population engaged in trade and alliance with the local Native Americans. Meanwhile, the British colonies had millions of settlers hoping to expand westward for farmland. Austria, which held a position over the Holy Roman Empire and the German states, faced a new threat in the militaristic kingdom of Prussia. In the previous War of Austrian Succession, the Prussian King Frederick II seized the valuable territory of Silesia from Austria. This was fairly dangerous for the Austrians, as their power over Germany was based on keeping the small states divided and influenced. With all this tension, British and French colonial forces began clashing in 1754, which would eventually escalate to a North American theater known as the French and Indian War. As the war continued in the colonies, fears broke out in Britain that this war could extend to Europe. In order to prevent this, the British set up an alliance with the Prussians. The French worried about this alliance and asked Austria for support. With hopes to end Prussia's rising power, Austria agreed to ally with France. Later on, the French extended their alliance to include Russia and Sweden, while Britain had additional support from their ally of Portugal. As the war continued, things looked better and better for the French, while Prussia was being invaded on all sides. The British raided French holdings on the African coast, secured control over North America, and kicked the French out of their holdings in India. But the war in Europe still looked dire, until 1761, in an event known as the Miracle of the House of Brandenburg. The Empress Elizabeth of Russia died, and was succeeded by her nephew, Peter III. In a moment of Prussian weakness, Peter III, an admirer of Prussia, decided to negotiate an armistice and exit the war. And morale in France dropped, while Austria suffered military defeats. Pretty soon, French King Louis XV withdrew from the war with Prussia, and the war with Britain ended shortly afterwards. In 1763, the great powers signed the Treaty of Paris, which ceded many of France's colonies in North America to the British. A few days later, Austria and Prussia negotiated the Treaty of Hubertusburg, where Austria and Saxony recognized Prussia's gains in Silesia. This war had immense consequences for the future of Europe, India, and America. The Prussians had certified themselves as the strongest German state, which would culminate in them uniting Germany a century later. Britain gained control of much of North America, however blocked colonial expansion. Britain also began taxing the 13 colonies extensively to make up for the war debt they were in. These factors would escalate to the 13 colonies rebelling in the American Revolution and War of Independence a few years later. France's ambitions in India were destroyed, and this laid the groundwork for the British East India Company to dominate the continent and begin British control over all of India. In France itself, the war brought them into debt and tensions grew between the population and the nobles. The image of the monarchy soured, and the next king, Louis XVI, proved very incompetent. This would eventually lead to a violent revolution, the establishment of republicanism in France, and the Napoleonic Wars. What if that changed? What if the 7 Years' War ended in a victory for the French rather than the British? Well, since this war had three distinct theaters, there have to be changes for each of these regions. However, first, we need to change the British naval dominance, which significantly affected the French, specifically the 1759 Battle of Quiberon Bay, where the British hoped to end French naval threats. Here, the British attacked with 24 ships against the French's 21. While the British lost 2 ships, the French lost 6. For one of our changes, the British have to lose this battle. They easily could have if their attack was delayed and they suffered from the intense winds in the area. The British will be unable to inflict such a crushing defeat they had in our timeline, so the French are able to navally contend with the British throughout the war. Here, the French are able to continue naval attacks against the British, preventing them from fully blockading their ports. Therefore, the French can continue to send troops to their colonies, a policy which produced strategic victories for them when attempted in our timeline. The two important French outposts in North America were Fort Beauséjour and Fort Louisbourg. However, in our timeline, the British captured them and gained access to the St. Lawrence River, eventually being able to defeat French forces at the decisive Battle of the Plains of Abraham, aka the Battle of Quebec. In this timeline, the French are able to defend both of these positions in 1755 and later in 1758 against the British. These victories keep the French and British colonies stalemated and prevent the expulsion of Acadians that we saw in our timeline, where the British deported over 11,000 natives after seizing the territory. In India, the French saw some success in our timeline when they aligned with Indian states to fight forces led by the British East India Company. Many of the company's successes can be attributed to Lord Robert Clive, a governor and founder who led successful campaigns for the British in India. So in this timeline, Robert Clive needs to not be appointed as a military leader. Let's say his ship sinks while en route to India. Several battles go differently, such as the siege of the port city of Madras, which ends in a French conquest. The French would secure their victory with a decisive defeat of the British at Wandiwash, preventing the British from securing control over southern India. At last we go to Europe. In our timeline, one of the most decisive battles in this theater was the Battle of Rossbach. This was a Prussian victory which encouraged Hanover to re-enter the war. In this timeline, the French overwhelmed Prussian cavalry and artillery, winning the battle and preventing a whole string of battles from occurring, keeping much of Germany under France and their allies' control. Our final change comes as a result of preventing the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. In this alternate timeline, Empress Elizabeth lives just a bit longer, keeping Peter out of power and Russia in the war. By this point in our timeline, Prussia was at a breaking point, and now without the Russian exit, their victory is extremely unlikely. Russian forces are able to capture Berlin, while Saxon and Austrian troops secure Silesia, and Swedish troops take control of Pomerania. Under severe pressure from all sides, and a lack of British subsidies, Prussian King Frederick II is forced to surrender. Shortly afterwards, many French allies would end their involvement in the war, as countries like Saxony, Russia, and Sweden entered to fight Prussia exclusively. Since the war is between the French and British now, naval battles and losses continue to ramp up. Under significant pressure from the public, the British government calls for an end to hostilities. With France and their allies having won the war, what would this alternate peace look like? The British and French would meet for an alternate Treaty of Paris, where France now has significant leverage in the negotiations. New France is kept under French control, while disputes in the Ohio Country and Canada are resolved in France's favor. In India, the French reaffirm their gains on the continent, and British control in India is diminished, with the British forced to recognize several Indian states and refrain from political interference in them. France keeps its Caribbean colonies, giving them their advantage in the profitable sugar trade. French fortresses in Dunkirk and along the coast would be allowed to remain rather than being demolished by the British like in our timeline. As for the Treaty of Hubertusburg, more nations would be involved, as France and their allies would be given free range to partition Prussia. Sweden expands their Pomeranian territories in the north, France annexes some western territories, Austria reannexes Silesia, Saxony is expanded, Russia annexes East Prussia, and the House of Hohenzollern is disbanded, with them and many other Prussian elites fleeing to Britain. So, as we enter the 1760s, the European balance of power is shifted from Great Britain to France. As the French revel in their victory, they use the victory to their advantage and take direct control of infrastructure in many Indian states. Meanwhile, the British East India Company is blamed for defeat in India and is likely disbanded. Contrast this with our timeline, where the EIC took control of much of India after the war and set the path for British colonization. Now, does this allow France to sweep in and colonize India themselves? Unlikely. Despite British losses, the French lacked the proper logistics and power to colonize all of India like the British did. So in this timeline, the Maratha Empire, a loose confederation encompassing much of India, would expand across the subcontinent and likely form close relations with the French, who have a presence in the south. However, their control is unlikely to last longer than a few decades. For the British, the only viable way for them to regain control of much of India would require negotiating with local rulers in a tedious process which could take several years. This likely removes the atrocities and harsh policies the EIC enforced in our timeline. The French begin sending convicts to work off their sentences in India and New France, hoping to kick off a boom in their population. This could have been accomplished by promising land and money to commoners in exchange for them settling. However, there was likely not enough drive by French leaders to achieve these reforms, and these policies could likely bring the French in conflict with their Native American allies. In the British 13 colonies, their population continues to grow and outnumber the French colonies, but the French are much stricter in preventing westward expansion, likely arming natives to keep the British out. As a result, the 13 colonies aren't as rebellious to the British as they were in our timeline, seeing the Crown as their close protector. The fear of French domination or invasion overwhelms the American feelings of taxation and violent revolution. It's entirely possible figures like Benjamin Franklin instead become advocates for a close relationship with the British government. This means that as a whole, the American Revolution won't happen, and if Britain wants to tax the colonies, then they would have to be accompanied with reforms to appease civilians. In Europe, the up-and-coming Kingdom of Prussia has been destroyed. While this lays the groundwork for Austria to emerge as the main power of Eastern Europe, they soon find themselves at odds with Russia and the Ottomans. The Austrian alliance with France, which was established to defeat Prussia, has little basis after the war, and the two countries could begin to oppose each other again. Russia, who took control of East Prussia, has little reason to maintain the territory for itself. In our timeline, they plan to sell it to Poland, and in this timeline, this deal goes through, with Russia obtaining Courland and several border territories. Specifically, this would leave Poland in the firm Russian sphere of influence, with the Russians likely influencing Polish aristocracy to be loyal. In our timeline, the Austrians grew increasingly suspicious of Russian victories against the Ottoman Empire. Austria and Russia began a threatened war until Frederick the Great proposed a partition of Polish territories to draw their attention away from war. In this timeline, Prussia isn't able to make this suggestion. As a result of Russian influence, the Austrians and Russians raced for Balkan territories, with both attempting to exert influence on the Ottoman Empire. As for France itself, many depict a victory in the Seven Years' War as the start of the French overshadowing British influence. Due to Britain's influence after the war in our timeline, this conclusion is understandable, however unlikely to end up happening. While Great Britain was a parliamentary-focused, stable constitutional monarchy, France operated as an economically unstable conservative state under an absolute monarchy, who didn't cater to the people. With a victory in the Seven Years' War, the French government has no reason to engage in reforms of their government and will likely continue on a doomed path. Trade in India and America may cause some initial benefits, but an overstretched empire and funds going to the naval force diminish those results. Coming into the 1770s, the French government still suffers from debt. Hunger is still rampant among the 30 states, and nobles and clergymen preside over a corrupt feudal system crumbling at the seams. In general, the issues France suffered from in our timeline aren't fixed by this victory. Industrialization may be a slower or smaller process in Europe, with nations like France pushing back against such efforts. With continued disputes across Europe, this could expand into a large conflict, meaning that another war between the French and the British could occur in the 1780s or 1790s. But at this point, several major factors have changed drastically. Germany's unification is fairly unlikely at this moment in our timeline. Spain retains much of their colonial empire, altering the later revolutions and histories of countries like Mexico. The Netherlands retain their valuable overseas possessions in Singapore, India, and South Africa. Italy's unification is also improbable, with many states coming under respective Austrian or French influence, while others like Venice remain independent. Policies and events between Europeans and Native Americans have also been changed, and figures like Frederick the Great, George Washington, and Napoleon Bonaparte may be forgotten, drastically changing what we imagine as modern world history. At this point, any predictions of this timeline far beyond this point are hard to tell. Will France retain their place in the sun? Will Great Britain reassert their dominance across the world? How important is the lack of an American Revolution or Napoleonic era? Comment what you guys think will happen down below and what other video ideas you want to see. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.